Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video that is all about where to start with ancient classics. And this is specifically for those of you who are beginners to the world of ancient classics. I think these books are some of the easiest to read, and I think they are a great gateway into antiquity. I think the ancient classics hold a lot of intimidation for people, maybe more so than more modern classics like Victorian classics, just because there's not only a gap in language, but there is a gap in culture and in understanding. But I really think that there is a lot about ancient classics that makes them far more approachable than things like Victorian classics, because you are often reading these through the lens of translation. And so unless you are fluent in ancient Greek or Latin and you can read both of those languages, you are likely going to be reading these works in translation. And I personally think that helps make them a bit more approachable and easier to read. When I'm asked where to start with classics, I often say a translated classic is a pretty great way to go, because I think often translators will modernize the language for you. Now me, I like kind of outdated language. That's part of the reason why I read classics, is just because I really enjoy the language of times gone by. And so I often hunt down translators that I think are doing that. But if that's part of the intimidation for you, there are so many great modern working translators who are really updating language. And so my first key bit of advice to you would be to try a bunch of different translations. All of the works that I'm going to mention here today come in various different translations, and you may not like certain translators. You may not like a certain translator style, and so I just recommend that you pull down a bunch off the shelf. If you're at the bookstore, if you're at the library, you read the first couple of pages. You read the same first couple of pages and just see what you prefer. I think I only have 6 recommendations here, but these were the 6 things that automatically popped into my mind when I was thinking about where I would tell someone to start with the ancient world, specifically the Greeks and the Romans, which are the only cultures of antiquity that I feel comfortable speaking on. I read Gilgamesh, but it was so many years ago that I honestly don't feel comfortable recommending it, and I think it's something that I read in school, and I'm not very well read in any other cultures of antiquity, and so this is just Greek and Roman recommendations, sadly. But let's go on and get into my list. The first thing that I would recommend is the Oresteia by Aeschylus. This is a trilogy of ancient Greek plays. It is, in fact, the only trilogy of ancient Greek plays that we have surviving. And so that's kind of why I want to recommend it as a place to start, because you are going to get a full and complete story here. Unlike with things like Prometheus Bound, also by Aeschylus, where there were 2 other plays in the cycle that didn't survive, this is a complete narrative and it is a complete story. It's also really, really exciting because this is essentially about the cycle of murders in one family. The first play, Agamemnon, is one of my favorites, and it is possibly my favorite ancient Greek play now. I just really, really enjoy the vicious quality of this trilogy. There is so much going on in it that is really complex and interesting, and I think it's also dealing with subject matter that probably will not come as a surprise to a lot of you. Agamemnon specifically, of course, deals with Agamemnon, who was the leader of the Greeks in the Trojan War, and his wife, Clytemnestra. Cassandra is there. And that's another great tip, I think, is to read something where you're kind of familiar with the story, where you know what the outcome is going to be, because I think that takes away some of the level of intimidation that's there as well, because that's not an added bit of confusion for you. You can focus on reading a different format, on reading a book about a different culture, or reading a book with more dense language, but you're not really having to worry about how to keep up with the plot. But what's always great too is that the ancient Greeks are telling it possibly in a different way to the modern day. So you're getting a different telling of events than the one that you might be familiar with. But this is a really great place to start. This is, I think, one of the places that I started my journey with ancient classics, and it was definitely in school. The majority of these I've read in school. Ancient classics in general have not been ones that I have fully revisited outside of school. And I think that's also aided me in my love for them, is to have that discussion aspect. And so maybe a buddy read is also a great piece of advice, because then you're constantly discussing it with someone else. And I think ancient classics benefit from that in a way that other books maybe don't. But the Oresteia is a really great place to start. It's action-packed. Because they are plays, they read relatively quickly. And you can also watch adaptations of the play on YouTube, and that can help you out as well. I really did not want to make this all about poetry because I know that plays reigned as king, especially in ancient Greece, but I really do recommend the Oresteia as a great place to start with plays. When it comes to Greek poetry, though, we do have to talk about the giant. And I think if you're interested in ancient classics, you know who this man is, and you're probably interested in ancient classics because you want to read his works, and that would be Homer. Homer has two bigs. He has the Iliad and he has the Odyssey. The Odyssey is where I would recommend that you start, even though chronologically it comes after the events in the Iliad. And those of you who have been around on my channel for a long time know that I am not the Odyssey's biggest fan. I really prefer the Iliad. In fact, the Iliad is one of my favorite books of all time. But the reason that the Odyssey edges out the Iliad when talking about where to start with ancient classics is that it, akin to the Oresteia, is a complete story. You are getting a complete narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. The Iliad was part of a longer cycle that also didn't survive, and it is telling a snapshot of events in the Trojan War. The Odyssey is about Odysseus, who was a part of the Greek side of the Trojan War, and it is about his very long journey home. This is an epic poem, and I know that that sounds really intimidating as well, to think about reading a really long piece of poetry, but the meter here is not complicated. And I think the story is so adventurous and fun that you kind of get lost in it. You almost forget that you're reading verse a lot of the time. In the Iliad, to me, you never forget that. You often feel like you were reading poetry, which again, I think is partially why I prefer the Iliad. The main reason that I don't like the Odyssey is that I hate Odysseus with a passion. I would fight him. If I came across him, I literally would fight him in a bar. I don't like him at all. And so I really did not enjoy spending time with him for pages and pages and pages. And the Odyssey is probably a book that many of you visited in school. It is one that you should read on your own. I think it's really fun on your own. I don't know how many times we had to read this in university. I think I read it in 3 different classes. And never once did we approach the Iliad, which I think is really interesting, but I think really speaks to the staying power of the Odyssey and how approachable it is. I am an outlier here. I am one of the few who really does not like this, but most people absolutely adore the Odyssey, and I'm planning on rereading it this year in the Emily Wilson translation because she is also translating the Iliad, and once that comes out, I'm going to read them back to back. I'm so excited. And in a different translation, I may have very different feelings. Each of the 3 times that I've read this, I have read it in this edition that was translated by Robert Fagles. But a lot of people do tend to have issues with him. Again, this just depends. The Odyssey is something that has been translated ad nauseum, so you definitely have your pick of translators here. Let's go ahead and jump into the Roman side of things, because the Romans are my favorite, and I actually prefer a lot of Roman classics to ancient Greek classics. And so when thinking about poetry, just regular poetry, not epic poetry, I feel like there is a clear winner here. I recently reread this author, and I think his poetry is funny, it's very interesting in a political and historical sense, and it's beautiful. And that is Horace. Horace is such a contentious one because some people really don't like him, and some people really love him. I tend to really like him. I just recently reread this back in, I think, March or April, and it was a delight to me from start to finish. This is a series of shorter poetry, the Odes and Epodes. That's a style of poetry that was begun in ancient Greece that Horace kind of adapts. And so these are really short poems that you can read here and there. But the best part is that Horace is really funny. A lot of the poems are really funny, and I always want to applaud when jokes land thousands of years later. Horace was also just in general a really interesting dude. He lived during the time of Julius Caesar's assassination, what went down with Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Augustus becoming the emperor. Horace was there for all of that. He was on the front lines and he was a soldier. And so some of his poetry has a really interesting political bent to it that I think makes it very fascinating from the historical perspective. In truth, I just really think he has it all. He's got the humor, he's got the politics, and sometimes he has the romance, which I think a lot of us are looking for when we're trying to read poetry. There are so many beautiful poems in here. I just really like Horace. If Horace has a million fans, I'm one. If Horace has no fans, I'm dead. I really like him. And I can see why he doesn't work for everybody, but I think in terms of length, his poetry is really approachable. I just think he's an ideal place to start if you're curious about ancient Roman poetry. And he's also writing at a very interesting time, kind of the cusp of the Republic turning into the Empire, which is really interesting in terms of art that was being produced during that time. So I think he's interesting on a bunch of different levels, and I think he's a great one to start with. Because I'm me, and we do actually have to talk about epic poetry, let's talk about where I think you should start with epic poetry in ancient Rome. There are so many great options here. I could have told you Lucan, but I wouldn't torture anyone with that right off the bat. I love Lucan. I want to talk about him more, but he's such an odd one, not one to begin with. But someone I do think you can begin with, and this might be kind of controversial, but I think you can begin with Ovid. I recently reread the Metamorphoses with Faith from Faith in Books. I tried a new translation of it that I think really dulled its shine. I really did not enjoy that translation, but that again goes to show, just find the translator that works for you. But Ovid's Metamorphoses is an epic poem that is essentially about mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, from the time of the creation of the world up to the time of the Caesars. The theme, of course, is metamorphosis because the title is plural of metamorphosis. And so all of these stories have something about change within them, whether that is Apollo and Daphne, where Daphne turns into the tree, whether it's like Perseus and Medusa turns to stone. There's always a theme of metamorphosis and a theme of change in these stories. And I think this is a great place to start, just because there is an episodic nature to these stories. It feels like when you finish his telling of one myth, it's okay to put the book down and then wait to get back into it. So I think this is really a great one to start with in terms of epic poetry, just because I think having chapters in a way is really helpful. And if you want to put this down for a time and then come back to it, you can, and you won't have forgotten anything. Ovid was writing around a similar time to Horace, and so there is, of course, some really interesting political imagery and background to him writing this. And there is a lot of celebration of Augustus towards the end of this book and Julius Caesar. And so I think this is really fascinating. I think it's gripping. And so I do think you could start here, and I think you would probably really enjoy it, especially if you're someone who likes mythology. Most of this will not come as a shock to you if you're very familiar with Greek and Roman mythology. So I think that also will aid you here, because it is interesting how Ovid twists things, but I think a lot of the stories are familiar, and so that can be kind of comforting and make this work more approachable to you. One genre that was really quite popular during antiquity and that kind of came about during antiquity is historical nonfiction. And I love reading nonfiction from antiquity because it is a hoot and a half. In antiquity, people are not necessarily married to the facts. You read nonfiction today and it's people trying to convey to you what happened, often trying not to let their bias show. Not so in the ancient world. When history was first starting to get written, people would make up speeches that folks said. They would insert their own observations and just talk a lot. It would be very gossipy. No sources were cited. It really was the wild, wild west in terms of nonfiction. And I think that means that a lot of them are really, really fun. And so if you are someone who enjoys nonfiction that is written today, take a trip back in time and read some nonfiction that was written during the Roman world in particular, because it really is fascinating. I did not get on with Thucydides or with Herodotus, so I don't want to recommend them here. They're also really, really long, so I don't necessarily think that's a great place to start. The book that I suggest you start with is The 12 Caesars by Suetonius. There are so many great ancient Roman historians. Livy could have gone here. Plutarch could have gone here. I have a real soft spot for Plutarch. But I think The 12 Caesars is just one of the wildest rides that you can get from an ancient classic. And this is really interesting because it is telling the history of the first 12 Caesars of the Roman Empire. So there are some real instances of him smoothing the edges off of some of these figures. But there is also a lot of kind of like whispering in your ear, like, can you believe this happened? And so the gossipy nature of this is really why I would recommend it. I think it's wild. Some of this is just hilarious to me. Reading about Nero will never get old to me. I will read anything about Nero. I think Nero is fascinating. Caligula is also fascinating. And they get a lot of attention in a book like this. But I think most of us, when we think of the ancient world, we think of Julius Caesar. And that's how this book kicks off. I was really torn on whether to recommend this or to recommend one of the historians like Livy or Plutarch who were writing about the turn of the Republic into the Empire specifically, because I think that is an event that is familiar to everyone, but maybe we don't know all of the details about. And so I think that would be fascinating to read, and I think is probably a great way to start with ancient nonfiction. But there is just something about the 12 Caesars that I think feels very modern on the one hand, but also very foreign at the same time. And so I think this is the best of both worlds. I think you'll have fun reading this, but I think you'll also learn a lot. So those are just a few of the ancient classics that I suggest you start with. I think these are all really approachable. I think they are a good gateway into the ancient world. And I think once you start, you won't stop. I really find antiquity fascinating. And where I started my journey with antiquity was a lot of these books. And so I definitely recommend all of these. I would love to know down below if you have read them. I would love to know where you suggest you start, what your favorite ancient classics are. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.